Shabbat Shalom, everyone, and such deep thanks to our cantorial intern, David Fair, and to our music director and pianist, Joyce Rosenzweig, to our Facebook rabbi tonight, Rabbi Yael Rapport. It's a whole new part of the team on Friday nights and Shabbat morning to have one of us as clergy communicating with everybody via the comments. And we do have services tomorrow morning, and if you will need the Zoom link to get it, and in the comments we will give you the information if you don't already have the Zoom link to join us. We try on Friday nights to do services a little differently than we do on Shabbat morning, and on Shabbat morning we do it by Zoom so everybody can see each other, so that you don't only see us as the service leaders. So join us tomorrow morning for Shabbat services at 10 a.m. Last week, I talked about the moment in our Omer counting, the counting of the 49 days between Passover and Shavuot of Lag BaOmer, the 33rd day of the Omer. And this, we are now counting down since Shavuot will soon be upon us at the end of May. But I want to talk tonight very briefly about somebody whose work I've been studying and I've mentioned in other moments, who is known as the Piaznishna Rebbe. The Piaznishna Rebbe birthday was on the 34th day of the Omer. And as a result, the 34th day of the Omer, the day after Lag BaOmer, is considered by many in Jewish traditional circles, and especially in Hasidic circles, to be a holy day because it is the birthday of the Piaznishna Rebbe. Now this Rebbe had a small following, but a very, very passionate one before World War II. He was born, as I said, on the 34th day of the Omer. And he became the Rebbe of this community outside of Warsaw. And in 1939, he, like all of the Jews of the surrounding areas of Warsaw, were forced into the Warsaw Jewish neighborhood, which became the ghetto inside of the old town of Warsaw. And he became one of the significant religious leaders inside the Warsaw ghetto. As soon as the ghetto was established and the Nazis had invaded Germany and took over, had invaded Poland and took over all of Poland, and Warsaw became the Jewish ghetto, all Jewish services were forbidden, of course. But the Piaznishna Rebbe continued secretly having Shabbat services all through the period of the Warsaw ghetto. There is much to be said about him, and I will, in the weeks and months and years to come, please God, make it possible, teach about him, because I think he and his writings have so much to offer us. In the beginning of the Nazi occupation of Warsaw, they bombarded Warsaw with violent bombardment before Poland fell. And in the bombardment, the Piaznishna's son, who was also a rabbi, was hit by shrapnel. The Piaznishna Rebbe tried to find a hospital who would take him and ran from hospital to hospital, and they were either full or would not be able to take him. Finally found a hospital that would take his son in. His son was unconscious and very sick. And every day the Piaznishna Rebbe and his daughter-in-law, married to his son, and his sister, others would come to the hospital and stand outside and recite Tehillim, recite Psalms. And in one of the bombardments, the hospital was bombarded, and the daughter-in-law was killed by the Nazi bombardment, and the son died a day or two later. So even before the ghetto itself was established, the Piaznishna's Rebbe lost his beloved son and his daughter-in-law, and he started immediately a synagogue community in which every Shabbos afternoon he gave a drashah, he gave a sermon. And it had to be secret. And after Shabbos, for the first year or so, a student of his would write down the sermon, because a Piaznishna Rebbe didn't write on Shabbos. And so after Shabbos, after Havdalah, the first thing that a student of his would do is to write down what the Rebbe had taught during the afternoon. And then that handwriting changes, and we have to assume that that student was deported. And then we only see the writing of the Piasetzner Rebbe himself after Shabbos, writing down what he had said earlier in the day. He continued this week after week after week after life in the ghetto got worse and worse and worse. He kept teaching Torah, and he kept teaching chizuk, strength, to the students. And he became very well known in the ghetto as this teacher. And when Emanuel Ringelblum, who founded Oyneg Shabbos, which was the group of historians, 50 historians and writers, who dedicated themselves to writing down every day what was happening in the ghetto, what was happening in the children's programming, what theater was happening, what was happening for health, what was happening with the older people, and what was happening in the religious communities. Emanuel Ringelblum understood that even if they were all destroyed, their job, their task, was to write down in detail so that the world which would come after would know the stories of the Jews who lived in the Warsaw Ghetto. And it was illegal, of course, to do what they did, and it was almost impossible to find paper and pen, and they wrote on all different kinds of scraps, and they gathered in secret, and Ringelblum gathered together all of these writings and kept pushing these starving historians and school teachers and women and men and children to write their stories down, to observe and to write down these stories. The deportations began in the Warsaw Ghetto in the summer of 1942. There were hundreds of thousands of Jews crammed into the ghetto, and thousands, tens of thousands had already died from starvation and from disease. But the deportation, which lasted a couple of months, started in the summer of 1942. And those deportations, 7,000 Jews a day, were taken to the plaza right outside the ghetto, loaded up onto cattle cars, and taken to Treblinka, and we know they were all murdered there. 7,000 a day, every single day. And the Piasetzner Rebbe kept writing, kept teaching Torah. His students were among those deported. He was considered an essential worker, and he had a job in a factory which kept him alive. And in January of 1943, after the massive deportations had been finished, and there were not that many Jews even left in the ghetto, and the resistance decided it was time to actually resist and to fight and to create what we now know as the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. Ringelblum called all of his writers, his scholars, the students, the children, the women, the men who were writing down the stories of the ghetto. And he gathered all of these materials in January of 1943. Because at that point, the Jews there understood there was going to be no rescue from the outside. And all attempts to try and get the outside world to help were to no avail. And the Piasetzner Rebbe's contribution were these massive volumes of pieces of paper, the collected work of all of the drashot and teaching he had done for those 3 years of the ghetto. He wrote a note on top of his documents. His writings, and all of the Oyneg Shabbos writings were divided up into different milk urns. And some of you have heard me talk about Emanuel Ringelblum's Oyneg Shabbos project. And they were buried in 3 different places in the ghetto, understanding that maybe some would survive. On the top of his papers, I want to read what the Piasetzner Rebbe wrote on the top of his documents. Just lost the page, but hold on. It was discovered December 1950. A Polish construction worker who was clearing away part of what had been the ghetto to build a foundation of a new building came across this milk urn. And in the milk urn was discovered these documents that the Piasetzner Rebbe and many of the documents of the Oyneg Shabbos had found. There were 100 sermons from these 3 years. And in those sermons, he had taken Torah from all of the Drashot, from all of the Parshiot, and taught Torah as bad as it was getting. in order to create a message of what will survive in the midst of terrible destruction. After the Warsaw Ghetto was destroyed in the spring of 1943, he was deported along with the remnants of the ghetto who were left. Most of the fighters were killed. Some escaped, not many, but a few escaped. But he was taken to a labor camp. And the Nazis then decided in November of 1943 to kill anybody left over from the Warsaw Ghetto that was in any of their labor camps in order to pay them back, pay the Jews back for the uprising that had taken place in the spring of 1943. So the Piaźnice Rebbe, along with any of the survivors of the Warsaw Ghetto who were in concentration camps and labor camps, were lined up and they were all executed. He left this piece of paper on top of his documents, asking if he were to survive, for whoever found these documents to send them to him. Maybe he would be in the Warsaw Ghetto, and if not, to send them to his brother who was living in Palestine. He, of course, did not survive. The documents were studied with great pleasure. To feel the connection to the Piaźnice Rebbe was a very deep thing. His books have now been published. In 1960, after years of study of very difficult manuscript, were published. They've been republished in multiple printings. There is now a synagogue in Woodmere, New York, which is followers of the Piaźnice Rebbe, and many in Israel and elsewhere around the world. And his writings are now considered a fundamental sacred text in the Jewish people. So there'll be much more to teach about the Piaźnice Rebbe, but here's a few things I want to offer you. First of all, write down your stories. Don't be shy about thinking that what you're living through is not significant. It matters. Write down your stories of what we're living through now. And also, of course, remember there are those who have had it worse. It's not that we have the worst conditions of the world, and we don't know how bad it will become. But we should all be the storytellers of our story. The Piaźnice Rebbe himself did not survive. Both of his children were murdered. Both of his daughter-in-law and his son-in-law were murdered. He had no survivors except for his brother. And now his nephew teaches his teaching in Israel, and his work is known everywhere. People are studying his work even though he does not survive. We cannot know what will become of seeds we plant, no matter how bad the circumstances look to us. We cannot know what will be, even after we are not alive. We for sure know that if we give up or give in, if we don't understand our role is to continue to strengthen institutions and build foundations for the future, and not only focus on our personal well-being, as important as it is, and I think we should, but to understand there will be a future that needs us to continually be planting seeds for them. And I'm so moved and proud to be part of this community, which is about writing our story for generations to come. Many of us do not have children of our own, technically, but by being part of a community, we are planting seeds for a future. There's a wonderful movie called Who Will Write Our Story about the Oneg Shabbos project of Emanuel Ringelblum. Watch it if you can. And ask ourselves, the LGBTQS Jews of New York City and all of our friends from around the world, who will write our story? It will be up to us. May you be blessed this week as we come towards the end of this month of Omer, blessed by those who came before us, standing on the shoulders of those who came before us. May the blessings of the Piaźnice Rebbe and all of those martyrs of the Warsaw Ghetto and of the Shoah inspire us. They would want us to continue living with strength and with an understanding that we are carrying them with everything we do. May you all be blessed. May you feel some joy. And may you, each of us, help us all to write our story. Shabbat Shalom, everyone. Shabbat Shalom. Love and blessings to each of you.